All right, you've listened to the first two episodes of this series, right? This is the third and final interview segment of my January 2016 interview with Keith Preston, talking about totalitarian humanism. Here we go.
Are part of the legacy of that I would not criticize, would support. But it's also true that we have to criticize excesses that come from movements that are supposed liberation movements as well. And we need to criticize the excesses of, say, Robespierre. We need to criticize the excesses of Lenin and Stalin and Mao. And we need to criticize the excesses of totalitarian humanism. I don't see totalitarian humanism and this kind of statist progressive ideology that it reflects to be a force for any kind of liberation. I don't see it as any kind of anti-authoritarian movement. I don't see it as any kind of particularly democratic movement. I don't really see it as a liberal movement. What I see it as being is illiberal, in the sense that if we look at the implicit assumptions behind what the so-called social justice warriors or whatever believe, they essentially have an ideology that is, first of all, very state-centric in terms of its implications. And we see that creeping into the institutions today. For example, I'm constantly coming across articles about excesses of, say, child protective services, where they go out and arrest parents for letting a kid play in a park by himself or something like that, because that's now child neglect. There really is a such thing as child neglect. There really are abusive parents. But nowadays we have abuse and neglect being defined in all sorts of extravagant ways that is intended to give all sorts of arbitrary power to state institutions over the institutions of civil society, like families. We see increasingly separation of church and state coming under attack. One example of that is the way that people who have a religious objection to gay marriage can be sued for not baking someone a cake or something like that. So all of these things are ways of eroding the autonomy of civil society and the kinds of institutions that serve as a bulwark against political authority, whether it's families, communities, religions, voluntary associations, businesses, unions, whatever. That's one thing. We also see that the social justice warrior is movement, or just call it totalitarian humanism. We see that they are very big on strong central government. A good example is what the reaction we've seen on the left to this incident that happened in Oregon recently, this standoff between some of these militia guys and the Bureau of Land Management. Now, whatever one's perspective on that controversy, whatever one thinks of these militia guys, what I thought was interesting is the way that the left is suddenly taking a law and order position, which is something they're not traditionally known for. But it looks like whenever you have so-called right-wingers are committing crimes, then all of a sudden they switch from their view, we need to look for the social causes of crime, or taking we need to avoid overly penalizing crimes. All of a sudden they're adopting a very law and order, go in and stomp these guys type of perspective. And essentially you have so-called liberals and leftists coming to the rescue of the feds here. And we see this in foreign policy. Increasingly, we see liberal and left rhetoric or progressive rhetoric being used to justify military aggression. And we see that among Democrats and Republicans. We saw it with George W. Bush saying he's going to bring freedom and democracy to Iraq. We saw it with Obama and Hillary Clinton saying they're defending human rights in Libya. And so we see that these people seem to recognize very little in the way of limits on state power if they think it advances what they consider to be social justice in some particular way. And they also seem to have a very mannequin, very dualistic view of the world, in the sense that there's the good guys, the progressives, there's the bad guys, the reactionaries, and society is in this mortal struggle between good and evil, between the forces of light and darkness. And anybody that's on the other side, anyone who was a conservative or a reactionary or a privileged white male or male chauvinist pig or a homophobe or some adherent of traditional religion, they're essentially in league with Satan. They're on the part of the forces of darkness. Um, and there's also a tendency to demonize entire categories of people. White people are guilty of racism by virtue of existence, which is interestingly very similar to the Christian Calvinist view of original sin, or straight people are by definition homophobic, or men are by definition sexist simply by virtue of being men. We see demonization of entire categories of people based on classification, irrespective of what they personally do. And we see the same thing in the reverse. We see the deification, the glorification of entire classes of people, irrespective of what they personally do. For example, it's assumed that all minorities, all women, all gay people, all environmentalists, all workers, all social justice advocates, whatever, are by definition virtuous, deserving of sympathy, deserving of respect, irrespective of what they personally do in terms of their individual conduct. And we see the people in the social justice movement turning on each other. The case of James Howard Kunstler is one. There was a case in Oregon I had a while back of a woman who was a feminist who was considered to be transphobic, I believe. And then she was also, I believe, a vegetarian, but not a vegan or something like that. She was actually physically assaulted over some of these kinds of issues.
I think you're thinking of Lierre Keith.
Yes, I am.
She actually wrote a book called The Vegetarian Myth. She's a former vegan, and she discovered the health benefits of eating meat, and she also did some research and found that farming denies whole swaths of land to all manner of non-human life forms. And you might be eating tofu, but that tofu comes at the expense of other creatures that would have been living on that land. So you're not sparing any animals by not eating animal flesh, particularly if you depend entirely on the industrial agricultural system to provide your food to you. And some radical vegans took offense at this, and she was on stage, and they made a pie that was really just a bunch of frothy, egg whites or something, but it was filled with cayenne pepper, and they hit her in the face with it. So that is how the supposedly peaceful, loving, compassionate vegans treat their ideological enemies, particularly when their enemies are close enough to them to seem like family.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. These people are all supposed to be great humanitarians, fighting for justice and freedom and equality, and yet they do stuff like that. And as you were saying, it's the people who are the closest to them that they hate the most. Well, one thing that I've experienced with that is I have noticed more and more that among the different identity politics groups, there's no one that they hate more than members of their own group who don't toe the party line. For example, if you ask people from the anti-racist milieu what they think of black conservatives, it's interesting to hear the kind of answers that you get, which they all of a sudden they start sounding like someone from the Ku Klux Klan talking about a black person, or if you ask the feminists, the radical feminists or the gender feminists or whatever, what they think of non-feminist women, or what they think of feminists who are critical of feminism. If they ask them what they think of Camille Paglio, ask them what they think of Christina Hoff Sommers. If you ask people from the LGBT identity movement what they think of, say, a gay Republican, well, I mean, it's like worse than sin. And I've experienced that because as an anarchist, I criticize political correctness as an anarchist, and I criticize it because mostly because I see it as being within this tradition of authoritarian or totalitarian leftism of the kind that has existed in the past. I see totalitarian humanism as the new Bolshevism, as the new Jacobinism. And if you look at the history of the relationship between anarchists and Bolsheviks, you see that Bolsheviks have always been just as quick to shoot an anarchist as Nazis have. And what's ironic is that you have the left-wing anarchists. They wax hysterical over conservative organizations and movements. At the same time, they pay no attention to members of far left Marxist-Leninist organizations in their own milieu and things like that. I've always thought that was interesting as well. But because I am an anarchist, a far left anarchist who agrees with most far left anarchist issues, and yet I criticize political correctness, and yet I also try to expand the realm of our ideas a bit, where I say, well, let's not just look at it from this left-right perspective. Let's look at it like, what issues do people from the center or from the right have that fit in with our own paradigm on some level? Or let's find people all across the political or cultural spectrum that might agree with us on some things, but not necessarily everything, but might share our opposition to imperialist war or excessive statism or this or that economic question or whatever. Or let's look at civil liberties issues that are often championed by the right but not by the left, but are consistent with like an anti-state paradigm. And other things like that. Because I do these kinds of things, I'm labeled a Nazi, a fascist. One thing that I argue as an anarchist is that freedom of association, freedom of opinion are pretty much absolute. And if you want to have an association of people that have quote unquote conservative views, whether it's some kind of traditional religion or the He-Man Woman Haters Club or white nationalism or whatever, you're within your rights politically to do that. Other people can criticize it if they want, but you're within your rights to do that. And I think that freedom of opinion, free inquiry, really has to be the first value of any kind of society or system or movement that is supposed to be libertarian of any kind, whether you call it liberalism or conservatism or libertarianism or anarchism or democracy. Open inquiry, free exchange of ideas has really got to be the foundation of all of that. And what I see among these so-called social justice advocates is precisely the opposite of that. I see them being more like religious fanatics who are trying to squelch heresy. For example, saying something that doesn't toe the left-wing party line about race, about gay rights, about gender issues, about the environment, about any number of other things, is not simply wrong or disagreeable or mistaken. It's heresy, it's blasphemy, it's apostasy, it's sacrilege. The kind of reaction you get to some of these people by expressing unapproved ideas or even entertaining unapproved ideas is probably not too far from the reaction you would get from a Saudi Arabian cleric, a Wahhabist cleric, if you express some heretical religious ideas. And that really, I think, is the principal difficulty with this, what I call totalitarian humanism. I think just the level of ideological fanaticism and intolerance that you see among these people. I think that the orientation towards statism and authoritarianism, institutionalized authoritarianism, and not just in terms of the government, not just in terms of what the issues I was discussing earlier in terms of government, but also just in a wider institutional context. For instance, the writer Ayaan Hirsi Ali, she is well known, obviously, and she is originally from Somalia. She grew up in a very conservative, fundamentalist Islamic environment. As a young woman, she moved to Holland. She became prominent in Holland as an outspoken critic of Islam, and she was awarded an honorary degree by Brandeis University. And Brandeis revoked her honorary degree because she was labeled an Islamophobe. Now, whether you agree with her views of Islam or not, I think it's certainly understandable, first of all, that she would have the views that she has, given her life experience. I also think that if you had someone who voiced similar criticisms of, say, Christianity, or say the Catholic Church or something like that, you certainly wouldn't have their degree being revoked. For example, would an American progressive university revoke an honorary degree given to Richard Dawkins because of his outspoken atheism? That by itself, no, probably would not have that effect. So We also see the issues like in the business sector. I mentioned the case of Brendan Eich at Mozilla recently. At the same time, we see that Boston has actually, I believe, denied permission for Chick-fil-A to open a franchise in Boston on the grounds that they are a homophobic company. You know, they're a Christian-oriented company that I believe their leaders or founders have criticized gay marriage, or maybe they contribute to religious right causes or something like that. And from what I understand, Boston has pretty much said, well, Chick-fil-A is not welcome in Boston. And you know, whether you like Chick-fil-A or not, or you know, it's really beside the point. You know, what I think is interesting about that case is there used to be an expression banned in Boston, and what that meant is that in past times, the political leadership in Boston tended to be somewhat conservative and puritanical, and they were always trying to ban something, you know, a play or an exhibit for being obscene, for being sexually suggestive or offensive or something like that. And now the same thing is still happening. Things are still getting banned in Boston for not towing the PC line, and that's you know, again, that's why I frequently criticize these politically correct social justice warrior, totalitarian humanist as a type of religious fundamentalism. You know, they're not progressive in any honest sense. They're not liberal in any honest sense. They're not fighting for freedom, justice, and equality. They're not anti-authoritarians. They're not about any kind of liberation. This is authoritarianism that mirrors that of religious fundamentalism and totalitarian political movements from the left or right, whether it's Marxism, Leninism, or fascism, or anything of that nature.
That was Keith Preston, and you'll definitely be hearing from him again. Hopefully, you will seek out his podcast and listen to some episodes of it. I'm not sure if this is the first time I learned of Keith Preston, but he came to my attention most recently thanks to Nexus Ex Humextris, who was a guest, I think, here on The Vault a few months back, and he was also a guest on Keith Preston's podcast, Attack the System. And in all honesty, Keith Preston's interview with him is much better than the one that I did. So I hope that you'll go and check out a few episodes of Attack the System podcast. But even if you don't, you will be hearing Keith Preston again here. I will talk to him again in the future. And also, I'm going to reuse his explanation of where the neocons came from, starting with the Trotskyites. I'm going to use that on the regular free C-Realm podcast the next time I put one out. All right. I hope that you have enjoyed this podcast. I hope that you listen to it a couple times, because unless you have just a laser-like focus and an amazing ability to recall information and synthesize it, I think a second pass over this content will do you good. It certainly did me good. All right, that is all for this episode of the C-Realm Vault podcast. Thank you for subscribing, and I will talk to you soon.
All right. Well, if you're listening All right, you made it to the end. Did you watch or listen to the full 90 minutes? If so, and if you really like this material, then you might enjoy some more material that you'll find in the C-Realm Vault. The C-Realm Vault podcast is available to people who subscribe to me or who follow me on Patreon at the $7 a month contribution level. And if you don't want to give $7 a month, folks who support me at the $1 a month level have access to various little knickknacks that I put up on Patreon, including some videos that I shoot and upload to YouTube, but which I list as unlisted, so that, YouTube doesn't promote it to anybody. If you don't have the link, you won't know about the video. You won't be able to watch it. The link will be in my Patreon feed. All right. Thanks so much for watching, and I wish you the best. Thanks so much for watching. And I won't see you in the next video because this is a parasocial thing we got going on here. I can't see you. You see me, I don't see you. It drives me nuts when YouTubers say, I'll see you in the next one, because they won't. Anyway, I'll see you in the next one. No. But if you post a comment, I will see that. Talk to you later.